This conference will now be recorded.
Hi, micro students, Professor George here. So I've decided that for chapter 13, there's lots and lots of material. So I'm going to break it up into 3 small lectures. So I'm not going to have narrated PowerPoints because I'm going to go through the PowerPoints in this lecture. And there's going to be 3 of them in 3 different chunks. The first one, the one I'm doing now, is on monopolistic competition. The next one will be on oligopolies, and then the third one will be on game theory. So we've studied so far, we've studied perfect competition, which is on way into this one end of the spectrum. It's multiple firms, many firms, many buyers, many sellers. The product is homogeneous. There are 0 barriers to entry. It's free entry and exit. Firms are price takers. No profits are earned in the long run. Then we did Monopoly, which is on the other far end of the spectrum. Monopoly is one firm. The product is unique. There are no barriers to entry, so it's blocked. And they are not price takers, they are price makers, and profit is available and accessible in the long run. So those are the 2 extremes, kind of bookends. Everything in the middle is where we pretty much operate in our economy. So if this is a spectrum again, with perfect competition all the way over to monopoly, the next one is called monopolistic competition. Monopolistic competition. When you think about monopolistic competition, know that the competition part of those 2 words is the dominant part. So those businesses in that industry structure look more like competition than they do like monopoly. So monopolistic competition is the next industry structure after perfect competition. Now, the characteristics of monopolistic competition are there's still many firms. There's still many firms. Entry and exit is pretty easy. Pretty easy still to have entry and exit. There's profitability in the short run, but not the long run. The main difference, the single big thing different from monopolistic competition, from pure competition, is the product is differentiated. If you remember, in perfect competition, there is no advertising because the product is homogeneous. So you can't lure people over to this market by advertising because you have the exact same thing as everybody else. Anytime you see advertising for a product, that product is not in a pure monopoly or in pure competition, because neither one of those folks need to do a lot of advertising. Monopolistic confrontation. So if you look at types of ice cream, I can say Sarah's ice cream is all organic, and we don't hurt any animals to make our ice cream, and all of our ingredients are the freshest they can be. So that could be how I advertise. I'm differentiating myself from somebody else's. Somebody else's is not organic and they hurt animals to make it. You get my point. You could say, my product is got more chocolate chips in it than the other people's chocolate chip cookies. So anything that you're trying to do to differentiate yourself, think about like fast food. They're not the same products. They're close, but they're trying really hard to differentiate the Whopper from the Big Mac, from the Wendy's, not Taco Bell, trying to differentiate themselves. So monopolistic competition is trying to differentiate. So let me pull up the PowerPoints and I'll go back and forth between reading what's on the PowerPoints and then coming back and looking at you when I'm trying to make a big point. All right, so here we have chapter 13. Some books have two chapters, one with monopolistic competition and one with oligopoly. I like those texts better, but this other text had enough good stuff. I chose this one. But there's enough information in here for 2 chapters. So the opening quote, the competitor is our friend and the consumer is our enemy. That's an interesting perspective. The competitor is our friend and the customer is our enemy. Well, we certainly don't want businesses to act that way. We want them to act as if in the interest of the consumer. So this is just going over what we said before. We studied perfect competition and pure monopoly. You know, these are ideals, these are constructs, these are perfect, or the enemy. You know, monopoly is kind of the enemy and pure competition is kind of the savior. But not many companies operate in those types of structures. The monopolistic competition characteristics are there's many participants, there's many buyers, and there's many sellers. Each one of the sellers has a relatively small hold on the market. There's free entry and exit. There's perfect information. People know all about both sellers. We're talking about the sellers. They have perfect information about prices and people's taste. And the product that they're selling is homogeneous, or another way we say that is differentiated. And that's how they try to win over market share, is by differentiating their product. So how are they similar or not to perfect competition? Remember, their structure is more like competition than it is like monopolies. The only thing that's really truly different is that they have a differentiated product. And because they have a differentiated product, they have a downward sloping demand curve, which is very different from perfect competition. You had a flat horizontal demand curve. So there is the opportunity for this firm in the monopolistic competitive industry to increase their price and not lose their customers if they can garner, you know, loyalty, customer loyalty to their product. And then the firm's more like a little tiny monopoly. In the long run, which who knows is how long the long run really is. I guess it's when you can change all your variable inputs. But in the long run, because there's free entry and exit, the monopolistically competitive firm will not be able to earn economic profits in the long run. But what firms hope to do is to keep flipping over the clock to what the long run is. So you differentiate your product, you're able to get a profit. And then before the long run comes, you differentiate your product in a new way, or you open up yourself into new product lines. So if you're in a monopolistically competitive environment, don't think that, I mean, economic profits are zero in the long run, but we know lots of businesses stay in business because they keep trying to differentiate themselves. And even if economic profits are zero, doesn't mean they won't still be in business. Now, so for every one of these industry structures, the first question really we're going to ask is, how do you determine price and quantity? Well, we know so far that you pretty much choose Q by where marginal revenue and marginal cost are equal to one another. So they're kind of like a monopoly in that they're going to find where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. And then they're going to take that quantity and go up to the demand curve. And the demand curve is going to tell you the price. And then you're going to compare at that Q, what's your P, what's your average cost. If your P is greater than your average cost, then you're going to earn a profit. If your P is lower than your average cost, you're going to earn a loss. I'll say that one more time. If the price that you're charging for your product, say $10 per unit, is higher than the average cost per unit is $8. So the difference between what I charge, 10, and what I earn, 8, the difference between what I charge, 10, and how much it costs me to make it, 8, that $2 is my profit per unit. Then I would take that $2 and multiply it times my Q. If the price that you charge for the product is $10, but the cost that it takes you to make it is $12, then that $2 is loss. You would take that and multiply it times your Q. You'll see in a few slides that adjustment process is different in perfect competition than monopolistic competition. So if you think of the perfectly competitive market structure is perfectly horizontal demand curve. That means that it's perfectly elastic. So if that's here, maybe I'll try drawing a little picture. So if you have a perfectly competitive market, it's a perfectly elastic demand curve. Perfectly elastic, should erase that very end there. Perfectly elastic means that if you change your price by even a few cents, your demand will go to pretty much all you could sell to 0. This is a perfectly elastic demand curve. Now, when you go to the next, going in your spectrum, right? The next one is going to be monopolistically competitive. So they do have a downward sloping demand curve, but it's not, whoopsie, it's still pretty flat. So it's still pretty flat. Do you see how, like, if I pivoted that down, it would be flat? So this flattish type demand curve is said to be an elastic demand curve, right? If you go all the way up to monopoly, which we already had, the monopolistic demand curve would be, more like this. It would be the least elastic, right? That would be the more inelastic as monopolist. This is monopoly. And this is monopolistic competition. Oligopoly's got a few special cases, so we won't draw that in there. But we're saying the main thing we're saying here is that the demand curve is flatter. It's more elastic because there's many substitutes. There's many substitutes, so it's very price sensitive. Okay. Now, I don't know which one, there's not one or two, but there's several different people in this class. Some people look at this graph and go, oh, shit, another one of these graphs. And others of you will be like, okay, let's dive in and see what we see. So let's dive in and see what we see. We know, I wish I could type over here instead of write in that goofy way. If we know, how do we determine Q? The way that we determine Q, like I said, I apologize for my bad writing. I'm going to always produce for marginal revenue equals marginal cost. We see here, this graph looks a lot like the monopolist. We have a downward sloping demand curve. We have a marginal revenue curve that kind of bisects it, comes in between. We have our, Nike-shaped marginal cost curve, and we have a bowed average cost curve. So first we'll find our Q, where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, and that is right here. That's going to come down and bring us this Q right here. So that's how we determine our Q, where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. The way that we determine the price that we're going to charge is we travel, up this curve. It's not straight over like it was in perfect competition, that 250. You're going to keep going up, and you're going to see where it hits the demand curve. Where it hits the demand curve is $3. Now, if you also travel up the same dotted line, where it hits the average cost curve is here. I always wish that they labeled them. Just so you know, this is labeled average cost, and this is labeled price. So whenever your price is greater than your average cost, you're going to be earning profits. And the profits are going to be equal to the difference between those. So the difference between the price and the average cost is 20 cents. So 20 cents times Q, whatever that number is, will be your amount of profit. So the way this graph is drawn, let me just repeat, Q is where marginal revenue and marginal cost connect, but you don't roll over to the price. You take that Q and you go straight up from that Q until you bump into the demand curve, what the market will bear. And you're going to charge $3 for this product. Are you going to make a profit or a loss? I'm going to go to that Q. I'm going to travel up that dotted line until I bump into my average cost curve. And then I see that my average cost is $2.80. It's less than my price, so I am earning a profit. Now this is going to be a little bit different. If you remember in perfect competition, maybe I'll pull up something. In perfect competition, if you were making profits, what would change is the supply of the product, which would then change the industry supply and demand, and so then the market price would change. In monopolistic competition, remember, it's going to adjust. So the way that it adjusts to get us back to economic profit is zero is that your demand curve will shift. Let me just show you real quick. Let's see, what's the easiest way to show you? I'm going to go over here. Let me go over here real quick. So in this graph, they are making a profit. So what would happen is, oh, wow, they're making a profit in this industry. So John, Jane, and Mike all decide to come in and come to this product to sell this product. When there's more and more people in this market, what will happen to your demand curve? Your demand curve, your individual demand curve for the firm, what will happen to your demand curve? If the market bears, the market sells 50 of whatever it is, and it used to be me and 4 other guys, so that was 5 of us, we all were able to sell 10. Our Q was 10. Now there's 50, but people went in on that action. So now there's going to be 10 of us. There's 10 of us that still have to share that same quantity. So what's going to happen to your individual demand in the market is the new demand curve. Let's see if I can draw this in a color that's really different. Your new demand curve is going to look like this. Your new demand curve is going to look something like this. So something like this. So the way that the price is brought down is you're still going to produce for marginal revenue. Your new marginal revenue curve will be in some more. You'll make less. So let me write it down since my graph's not beautiful. There is a better graph in your Ascend gauge. So if in monopolistically competitive market and earning profits, how are profits eroded in the long run? That's the question I'm trying to answer. I'm not drawing the best graph, but I'm trying to answer this question. What will happen is there'll be entry, Remember, there's pretty much free entry and exit. There's free entry, TRY. So with more firms, each individual firm has less demand. So the demand curve shifts inward. So this is really different than in perfect competition. If you remember, in perfect competition, it was the industry supply curve that would change as people left and entered the market. It was the industry supply curve. So when this firm is earning profits, the demand curve will shift and you will sell less product. And the price will come down. And as the price comes down, your profits are eroded. That's a big part of how monopolistically competitive adjustment process is different. Just really quickly, remember, I'm not going to save that. Remember, in perfect competition, what was the adjustment mechanism? In perfect competition, you have the industry and you have the individual firm. In perfect competition, this is just review real quick. In perfect competition, we had, supply and demand. I'll go ahead and draw this too. If I had $1 for every time I've drawn this L and wrote in price and quantity, I would be a rich woman. I know that I'm taking a little bit longer than I meant to here, but it's always good to have your mind refreshed a little bit. That's the demand curve. This is the supply curve. Those two things, the intersection of those, determine the equilibrium price. That equilibrium price is then brought over here to the individual firm. So that's why they're price takers. If you remember, I hope you do, the supply curve for a perfectly competitive firm was the part of its marginal cost curve that was above average variable cost. So that was their supply curve. And remember, they had a perfectly flat Mr. Darp. So if this firm, if they were making profits over here, if their average variable cost were, the average variable cost, average total costs were down here. If they were making profits, what would happen over here is a whole bunch of people would enter this market and you would shift the supply curve. When you shift the supply curve, that would then in turn drive down the price. And at this new price, the firm, if I drew it just perfect, it would not be earning any profits. So in the perfectly competitive markets, the adjustment mechanism to ensure zero profits in the long run is that the supply changes. In the monopolistically competitive firm, they're sharing a fixed amount of market. So the demand curve is what shifts to bring them back to equilibrium. So here we are in this picture again. It's the demand curve that shifts to bring you back into no profits in the long run. So this looks a little bit different also. Remember we talked about what's optimal for consumers is to maximize consumer surplus. The perfectly competitive market is the best for the consumer because you always pay the marginal cost. When you pay the marginal cost, that means you're paying exactly what it costs the firm to make it. So here is a monopolistically competitive firm. It always cuts off up here at the top. I'm never quite sure why, but just remember that, whoopsie, where'd it go? Okay. I got lost there for a second. So here we have a monopolistically competitive firm in equilibrium, and you find that it's not optimal for consumers. Let me tell you why. So you have this downward sloping demand curve. You have the marginal revenue curve bisecting it. This is your marginal cost curve, this red one. For whatever reason, the top of this doesn't show up in these PowerPoints. That's your marginal cost curve. You're going to produce for marginal revenue equals marginal cost. And then you're going to go up here and you're going to bump into the demand curve to find out what price you're going to charge. Remember, it's the price. The price is determined by demand. Now you're going to go up the same Q until you bump into the average cost curve and you see it's the same. So when you're in equilibrium and they're not earning profits, the price and the average costs are the same, right? Because we're always looking at the difference between I'm charging $285, that's the price I'm charging for this product, and it cost me $285 to make it. So that's how much I'm not going to be making any profits. Now this $270, remember, for productive efficiency is the point that you're producing at the minimum of your average cost curve. In perfect competition, you always end up at the minimum of your average cost curve. That's always where you produce, but not in monopolistic competition. In monopolistic competition, your equilibrium is a big deal. Is this an efficient outcome? This one right here? No, it is not. The most efficient outcome is this one here. Our most efficient outcome is this one here, because this one is where your average cost is at its minimum. So this, we talked a little bit about economies of scale, about how if you make more, your prices fall. So if you make more, if this firm were to make more, right, it would be operating at a cheaper price. It would be $270. So if it was operating at its minimum cost, they'd be charging $270, but they're charging $285 because they haven't reached this point. So is this efficient? No. This is our efficient outcome. This leads us to what we call the excess capacity theorem. So if you look back to this slide, whoopsie, if you look back to this slide, where they end up in long run equilibrium is right here at 10,000. They should be producing 15,000. So in monopolistically competitive industries, there's a lot of excess capacity. Firms do not produce the maximum they can make. There's excess capacity. They produce an output that's lower. So what's the bottom line for the consumer? The bottom line for the consumer is they're not paying the lowest possible price, but then it might be made up for by the fact that you have so many options, that there's a lot of more competition of heterogeneous products. You have more options. So it has wasted capacity, which is different than perfect competition, But the only thing that you might be gaining from that is you might be willing to pay a little bit more if you could get your double macchiato, no foam, half water. You see what I'm saying? If you could have exactly what you want in a industry that has more options. So yes, it would gain by having more firms. Fewer firms produce more, but we're not sure if they would be better off. I'll end this short lecture now, and I will post this, and I'll do another one that starts with oligopoly. Start practicing saying that, oligopoly, oligopoly.